Your special proclamation. Here we go again. Take two. Whereas city government, it's the government closest to the most citizens and the one with the most direct daily impact upon its residents. And whereas municipal government provides services and programs that enhance the quality of life for residents, making their city their home. And whereas city government is administered for and by its citizens and is dependent upon public commitment to and understanding of its many responsibilities. And whereas city government officials and employees share the responsibility to pass along the understanding of public services and their benefits. And whereas Florida City Government Week offers an important opportunity for elected officials and city staff to spread the word to all citizens that they can shape and influence this branch of government. And whereas the Florida League of Cities and its member cities have joined together to teach citizens about municipal government through a variety of activities, now therefore, the City Council of the City of Punta Gorda, Florida does hereby proclaim the week of October 22nd through 28th, 2018 as Florida City Government Week, and encourages all citizens, city government officials, and employees to participate in events that recognize and celebrate Florida City Government Week, passed and duly adopted in regular session the 17th day of October 2018. Rachel Kiesling, Mayor, and accepting will be City Manager Howard Kunick.
So this is our annual proclamation, and on behalf of all the employees, and actually the whole city organization, this is Florida City Government Week. And you know, it's kind of apropos because we just had Hurricane Michael, and what you don't know, you know now, Florida has a history going all the way back to Andrew of all the governments banding together in a great emergency response system throughout the state to help others that are in need. We had a lot of help after Hurricane Charlie. Florida is as a state, is kind of a leader in this, so quite apropos. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, next we have special presentations for the Volunteers and Policing Milestone Awards.
Thank you. This is Chief Pam Davis, Punta Gorda Police Department. I just wanted to say thanks to City Council members for allowing us to recognize some of our volunteers that are getting their milestone awards today. And before I bring them up, I want to give everybody a quick overview of the volunteer program. First of all, it's the best I've ever seen anywhere, so very proud of this program. There's three components. We have our reserve officer component, which is certified police officers that volunteer their time and help us with whatever we need. Then we have the chaplain program, which the chaplains, they support all of our employees. They help out when we need to make notifications, and they assist our citizens when there's a critical incident. And then we have our volunteers in policing program, which consists of the volunteers on patrol who are out there checking all our businesses, checking our homes when we're away, and checking the neighborhoods, as well as assisting our officers with just about everything. We have our Marine unit. They're out there patrolling all our canals and waterways, which we know we have a lot of those. They're rescuing boaters in distress, and they're helping out with boater safety education. Our records and our administrative volunteers, they greet our customers every day. They do our fingerprinting. They do all these administrative tasks that help keep us going every day. And then finally, our community services unit, which is our newest addition to our volunteer program. And they are out there at our community events, and they advocate for our department. And the final component of, I'm sorry, I actually already hit that with the reserve officers. But in fiscal year 2018, our 87 volunteers put in 11,743 hours. Wow. They conducted 3,827 directed patrols, navigated 4,840 miles of our waterways, completed 1,556 fingerprint sets, and so many other important tasks. So I want to bring up 4 of our volunteers that we're going to recognize for a milestone today. Come on up, guys. And I gave you kind of a background so you'd put in perspective, head right on up there. So we can put in perspective just how important the years of service that these men and women have given us. Go ahead, head on up and
up
face the audience.
Turn around.
So they can see you. So first we have Miss Charlotte Quinn of our records unit. She has completed, as of this year, 10 years of service. Mr. James Munns of our Marine unit, 10 years of service. And then, so you know, our volunteer unit began in 1997. So Mr. Frank Whipple started in 1998, with 20 years of service being completed this year. And then finally, also starting in 1998, our senior chaplain who runs and heads up our chaplain program, Reverend Bill Klossner. Do what we do without our volunteers. I want to thank all of you for your years of service. I can't even imagine the amount of hours you put in. We couldn't do it without you. And also Mr. Denny Chrisman and all of our volunteers here and our volunteer coordinators, thank you. You guys keep us going. We appreciate it.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, just to let you know that under new business, which was 7A, use of drone technology to improve city operations is going to be moved to the next agenda. The presenter could not be here this morning.
We might lose half the audience. For the,
Few, maybe.
because of the drone.
Oh, the drone technology?
I doubt it. There's a lot of people leaving.
Now is the time for anybody who wanted to introduce themselves for a board or committee position. Is there anybody here to introduce themselves for a board or committee position? Make your way over to this podium, but wait until the people exit so we can hear you. Just give them a couple more seconds.
Marion, close the door, please. Marion? Close the door, please.
Come on in. Okay, go ahead, please.
Good morning. My name is Paul Sacalotto, properly pronounced Paul Sacilotto. I signed, Karen told me to come here to make sure that you all knew I only had one head and both eyes. And so that's why I'm here. I've told Karen that I'd be willing to serve on either code enforcement, the Canal Advisory Board, since I live in PGI, and also the Planning Commission. So I provided a resume, abbreviated, and so that's why I'm here to answer any questions you may have.
Anybody have questions for Mr. Sacalotto? Thank
Okay,
you.
that's it. Thank you.
You betcha.
Anybody else want to introduce themselves for board or committee position? Now would be the time.
All right, my name is Tim Sullivan. I'm applying for the Canal Advisory Commission. And I have given you a resume in the past, and I think if there's any questions.
Any questions?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ray Dennison. I'm applying for the Canal Advisory position. And I did submit an application some time ago, but I'd like to add, just as a summary, that I live on a canal in PGI. And my seawall was recently replaced, actually in June, because of damage from Hurricane Irma. And that experience of having my canal seawall replaced actually was very positive. And I have a lot to say about that, actually, mostly positive, particularly about my interaction with the city. I'm a year-round resident. I own my own home and have lived here since January of '06. I am retired, and I am active in the community. A couple of the things that I have done were Meals on Wheels, Homeless Coalition, and sometimes I sew for the Charlotte Players. I'm a costumer. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to introduce themselves for board or committee? Okay, seeing none, we'll move into the public hearing agenda, the first of which is ZA 09-18.
Yes, and this is the first reading of an ordinance, which I'll read by title only. An ordinance of the City of Punta Gorda, Florida, amending Chapter 26, Article 8, Section 8.3, Punta Gorda Code, relating to exclusions from height limits, deleting provisions relating to a waiver from height limits, adding a new subsection relating to height limits for amateur radio antenna support structures and associated antenna, providing for permits for amateur radio antenna support structures, providing for conflict and severability, and providing an effective date.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, Lisa Hannon, zoning official. Read a brief summary. The current code allows for antennas up to 42 feet in height, which the city attorney has determined is inconsistent with the FCC regulations. A brief timeline regarding this amendment coming forward. December 28, 2009, staff received a request from a resident inquiring how to apply for a height waiver for an antenna. The city attorney provided a memorandum to staff regarding the extent to which the city may regulate the location and height of amateur ham radio tower antenna in light of Section 166.0435, Parent L, Florida statutes. The final determination was that the City Council would have the lawful authority to grant a waiver from the requirements of Chapter 26, Article 8, Section 8.3. The waiver request was never pursued by the resident. December 2015, City Council meeting, staff received a complaint related to an antenna being extended above the permitted height at all times. The city code provides an option to obtain a waiver, however, there was no established process, application, or fee for the same, adding, as a quasi-judicial matter, it must be advertised, which created a cost. Staff sought direction from City Council regarding establishing such process. Council requested that the city attorney update the memorandum from 2009. March of 2016, staff drew attention to the city attorney's updated legal opinion regarding the maximum height for amateur radio towers antenna dated February 5th, 2016, and requested direction from council on establishing a waiver process for antenna height. In June 2018, the draft ordinance was prepared by the city attorney, and in preparing the draft ordinance, the city attorney took into consideration comments received from other attorneys as well as residents who are ham radio operators, all of which were very helpful. The draft was also guided by information prepared by the National Association of Amateur Radio, which is intended to assist local government in the regulation of ham radio antenna structures. Such information also included a number of recommended ordinances from Florida and around the country to be used as guidance. The draft was also independently reviewed and considered FCC regulations, rulings, and case law on the subject matter. The draft ordinance in its present form is consistent with all applicable state and federal laws. The current code states in part that the limitations do not apply to spires, belfries, cupolas, antennas, water towers, fire towers, ventilators, chimneys, or to other appurtenances usually located above the roof line and not intended for human occupancy, provided such structures do not exceed the height limitations by 20%. The City Council may grant a waiver to these limitations where the applicant can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the City Council that the proposed structure will not unreasonably restrict the free flow of light, sunlight, and air to neighboring properties, nor otherwise be detrimental to the public health, safety, and welfare. However, currently there is no process for City Council to grant a waiver. After reviewing, city staff is recommending approval of the ordinance with the following amendment, which is consistent with the existing city codes for city code provisions for residential neighborhoods. Under Section 8.3, Parent B, Parent 2, Parent B, every antenna and amateur radio support structure shall be set back at least 7 1/2 feet from the side property line and 20 feet from the rear property line. The Punta Gorda Planning Commission did unanimously recommend denial of this amendment.
Thank you. What in the current code is not consistent with the FCC regulation?
The FCC regulations provide that it's a limited preemption. In other words, it's not a complete preemption on local regulation, but it does give us some limited authority. And that limited authority allows us to adopt local land use regulations which do not unduly restrict effective amateur radio communications beyond the minimal practical regulation appropriate to accomplish the local government's legitimate purpose. What that means is that you have to take into consideration what height is necessary for the equipment to work properly. And first, our maximum limitation of approximately 42 feet, I was advised when we first started looking into this that would not be sufficient to allow for the kind of operation that the amateur radio operators needed. And so the next step was, okay, well, then what is an appropriate maximum limitation? And that required a sort of a survey of what other governments have done and been successful in fending off challenges. And there is no one uniform number that is accepted across the board. But when you consider all of the different inputs that we received, the height limitation that we came up with in this ordinance of 70 feet is consistent with what we were seeing from the national organization and from the ordinances around the country. So that's where that number comes from in our ordinance.
Thank you.
And let me also say, our waiver in the ordinance that currently exists, which covers not just amateur radio operators, but other structures that might need to exceed our height, there is a process that will remain in the ordinance for a waiver. I don't know that we've actually had to deal with any of those other activities before, and if it ever becomes an issue, we'll probably need to put into some sort of ordinance what that waiver process consists of. But that was not as of immediate concern as the amateur radio process. So this only addresses amateur radio heights and not the cupolas or other types of structures that may pursue a waiver.
So basically, anybody that has an antenna right now over 42 feet is in violation of our ordinance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But if they were constructed prior to the ordinance, they'd be grandfathered.
They were
But
grandfathered in, okay.
Lisa, how many antennas do we have currently in BSI and PGI?
I have no idea, ma'am.
I was told there are only 2 in BSI, and there's only about 6 or 7 in PGI.
I don't know. Some may have been put up with or without a permit. So
Okay.
I have no answer to that.
And also, there are different types of antenna.
Right, I know that.
I profess no real knowledge about the subject other than what I've learned through the assistance of amateur radio operators that provided that input. At one point in time, there was at least one operator that was represented by an attorney who was very helpful in providing information. The National Association of Amateur Radio provides a lot of information to assist local governments in how to deal with the FCC regulations. And this is not an area that has not received a lot of attention. It indeed has received a lot of attention across the country, particularly when these radio antenna are to be located within residential neighborhoods, because obviously you can see them, they're high. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder. A lot of people feel that they may be ugly, but there is a recognition that they serve a valid purpose. And so there needs to be a balancing between the purpose that they serve and the impact to aesthetics. And that's, I think, what we're trying to achieve with our ordinance, consistent with the requirements of the law.
One more question. When was the last time we had a complaint to the city?
It was probably in 2015 when it was brought back up.
In 2015, was that a complaint by a neighbor, or was that
It was
somebody requesting a waiver?
No, it was a citizen complaint regarding an antenna that was left up all the time.
Got it, thank you.
Because of aesthetics?
They just complained that it was extended beyond the 42 feet at all times.
Gary?
Okay, as we have this discussion, and I just want to be clear for the public that may or may not be aware, but at this present time, because of Hurricane Michael, they were operating they are operating at the present time, they were operating during the hurricane. The Salvation Army is one of the organizations that depends on them. AT&T and Verizon were down for an extended period of time, et cetera. So they do, and we are survivors of a major hurricane within many of our memories. A number of people may not have been here. So I think that and I have the sense of all of us, but I can't speak because we haven't voted, but I have a sense of all of us that we are in strong empathy to allow the best solution for our community, to allow this service that is done by volunteers, and we are a community of volunteers, to continue. The issue that I'm hearing is the issue of the setback to the property lines, et cetera, to the antennas. So I'd like to kind of steer if we could, maybe the conversation a little bit to that way too, because I think on these other issues, it sounds to me like we're pretty much in agreement.
Yeah, it's not the service that they're providing that I think we're trying to address here. It's the waiver process, the way the ordinance is written. Of course, we want them to be able to operate, but then we have to take into consideration that we've had at least one complaint, and the fact that we know now that 42 feet is not adequate for their operation. I think we need to address that. Nancy?
Well, my father-in-law was a amateur radio operator, WDAX-9 in Madison, Wisconsin. And I know personally how important it is to our country and the service that they provide. So, and I acknowledge we're all in agreement there. You know, for us to get one complaint, we get complaints. And because we get one, you know, doesn't mean there's a problem. It means we may have an issue with a particular resident, or there could be a problem, but there may not be. And in this case, it almost feels like, as I listen to the conversation, there's probably more to this. If somebody's getting that picky, there's probably more to this. And somebody is, you know, it's in a neighborhood where somebody is, and this happens, where somebody has complained about the trash pickup. Oh, somebody put a bag of trash out. This happened a couple of years ago. Somebody put a bag of trash out instead of putting their trash in the trash can. And we didn't have an ordinance that allowed them to put a trash, so the neighbor was getting it back at the other neighbor. So,
And we acted on that.
we did. And so I think that, you know, we need to be, I feel that as a council member, I'm here to represent the residents in our community, and to get the best solution that we can. And so I really feel that I want to listen to what the residents have to
Yes.
say here, because this is a public hearing. But I think if we're going to put something in place, I don't want anything that's going to be punitive or that's going to provide a costly process to residents. We need to be facilitating the process and helping our community.
Any comments?
I just want to hear from residents.
Okay.
Yeah, I do too.
I just want to point out that in the testimony regarding the setback of 7.5 feet, that it was pointed out that 4 feet is allowed for air conditioners, trash containers, pool equipment, et cetera, provided that there's no active drainage easement. I would think as long as the antenna would also have no active drainage easement, that maybe we could comply with that type of standard rather than the 7.5 feet if that becomes prohibitive.
Any other comments?
I would, bouncing off of what Gary just said, the setback of 7.5 feet is not adequate, because that you're saying that the antenna has to be on the house. We have a 7.5-foot setback in PGI and BSI, and we have a 20-foot setback in the backyard. So you're saying that the antenna has to be actually on the wall of the house at that point because of our setbacks. So it's not realistic. You've got overhangs, you've got gutters, you've got other accoutrements on the houses that that go far beyond the 7 feet. So it's just not realistic, and I want to hear what everyone has to say, because I know there are several of the amateur radio operators here today, and I'm
Yes.
very anxious to hear them. I've talked to many of them already, so,
Do we have any ham operators here?
Yes.
yeah.
Okay, let's get on with the show. This is a public hearing. Please come to the podium, state your name, you have 3 minutes. This is a public hearing. If you'd like to speak on Z09-18, now would be the time. Please, if you're forming a line, if you have multiple speakers, make your way to the podium to expedite the efficiency of the meeting. I appreciate that.
My name is David Boland. I live at 712 Alyssa Drive. I'm one of the 2 towers in Burnt Store Isles. My tower happens to be 50 feet. The whole reason I purchased property in Punta Gorda is that I checked back in 1995. It told us this was a ham-friendly community, and there's basically no problems with antennas or towers in Punta Gorda. To give you a background, I've been a licensed ham for 57 years. I've been active in the military affiliate radio system for only 54 years. I'm certified to go into areas of disasters by the federal government. And if you can pass a DOD spec, you're doing fine. But the main thing is the comment that if the planning committee says, why do we need it? Why do you bring it up? That's one of the main questions. That if the planning committee says you don't need to pass it, I don't think you even need to talk about it, my opinion. The setback has been mentioned a number of times. That's ridiculous, because it isn't going to work. Like you said, you'd have it on the side of the house, unless you have a weird shaped lot, which I happen to have. And it shouldn't apply to, it should apply to towers, but not when you have a vertical stick and things like this. I think that should fall into slightly a different regulation. The comment is made on crank up, crank down towers. I have a crank up, crank down tower. That is for maintenance purposes, not for every day you use it. And the comment was made that you should crank it down every day you don't use it. Well, I use it, I'm on a MarsNet twice a day, most days. Doctor's appointments get in the way. And as far as FCC certified engineers, there aren't anything. FCC does not certify engineers. When I got my tower, I had a packet of information from the tower manufacturer, 28 pages of it, that listed the wind loading and all the constructions, and I don't think you need that kind of information. Another standing thing is it says the tower has to be removed within 30 days. Most often, at least in this community, the reason that Ham won't need his tower is because he died. The family has lots of things to do other than worrying about getting his tower down in the first 30 days. If you get the tower down within the time you're going to sell the house, I think that's fine. But within 30 days, I'm not sure that you should tell somebody, your dad just died, you got to get the tower down in a week. I mean, that's somewhat ridiculous. They might tell you something a little nastier than I said. And as they say, if we really need an ordinance or a waiver, then we should get a waiver permit. When I built my house in 2000, we bought the property in 95, Five Star Sandstar built the house. I said, do I need any regulations or permits for the tower? They checked and said, none that we know of. I checked with the local ham community and I was told you can have your antenna any place as long as the antenna does not go across the neighbor's property. You could have it within your own use, and that's how my system is set up. And the other last comment is people drive into my yard all the time. My tower is 54 feet high, the antenna's at 60 feet, and they don't even see it.
Thank you. Anybody else? CA 09-18, make your way to the podium, please. You planning to speak?
Good morning. My name is Glenn Tuttle, and I had prepared to address, but it's obvious that I'm preaching to the choir. I think you all agree that we do have a need for amateur radio activities in this county, and I agree with everything Dave Boland said, so there's no reason for me to repeat everything, but we do, every licensed amateur radio, we're not unique, Dave and myself. Everyone that has a FCC license and equipment is capable, ready, willing, and able to assist in any type of an emergency, whether it's an international, a national, or a state or a local emergency. And so I just would appreciate a waiver process that is simple and not ordinance and letting us get on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Ron Farley, KG4QIV, and I've been here before. And thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning. I wanted to talk a little bit about the honoringness of the code. I definitely concur with what everybody else said, so I won't repeat it. Definitely the setbacks are a big issue. I brought with me a 2-meter 440J pole. That's what I would use to talk on in a local area emergency. As you can see, this is pretty light. This is what we call a homebrew antenna. Basically, it's home built. So I do not have an engineering design spec on this. And if you look at the ordinance as it's proposed, any modifications, repairs, or additions to the antenna, you would have to go through the entire process. Well, I don't have wind load design, so I'd have to submit this to an air tunnel to have it wind tested. The closest one I know is in Langley, Virginia. I don't know what that would cost, $1,000. $500 building permit, and then have to have a PE evaluate the entire thing. So for a $41 antenna, I would probably have to spend, I don't know, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to be in compliance. You know, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's not going to be $200. So what that means to me as a citizen, you've now taken my ability to communicate for emergency communications and support my local community. And I just want to serve my community. And yeah, I love Punta Gorda. And part of the reason I moved here was for amateur radio and sailing. And I'm kind of getting older and having a harder time with the sailing, so I'm going to, kind of like Mr. Boland said, the last thing, you know, pry this J-pole from my dark, dead hands or whatever. Whatever. But thank you for coming to our field day. 2 of our guys and the police captain, he came by. So you can actually see what we do, and we do love our community. So I just say let's make life simple. This kind of, I don't know that we need this. And we want to keep the community safe. So that's all I have. Thank you, and I'll be around if you have questions or need help. Thank you.
How high in the air does that need to go, that particular home-built
Well,
pole?
we just did a test this weekend on 2-meter 440. And Bob Speck, who's sitting here, was chatting with me. He has a 70-foot tower. And we had amateur units all over the county and all within the city here talking on stuff. And I still don't have all the data, but Bob said he could hear most of them at 70 feet. I talked to Bob, Tom Mancuse, our president. He was going to be here, but his wife had a medical procedure this morning. And he's got a tower in his attic, which I do, an antenna. And he wasn't able to hear half the communications. So that's what's leading us to believe is we need to be at 60, 70, 80 feet. With VHF and UHF, I teach radio school also. Height is king. So the higher, the better, and the further the range of communication. 65, 70, 80 feet.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Anybody else on ZA09-18? Make your way to the podium. It's a short 3-minute wait for Mr. Gamblin. Make your way.
Maybe. Bradford Gamblin, NATOJ, amateur radio operator for 20 years. I've seen these problems crop up before, but basically this is a problem with 2 complaints, one in 2009 and one in 2015, and we probably have 50 people here that are saying this isn't really broken. We perhaps could do some fine tuning with what we have as an ordinance, but and I'm not sure we need an ordinance. Probably this could be handled administratively without creating a great deal of problems. The Planning Commission did unanimously say that basically that this is not broken. We don't have to go out of our way to fix something and create a lot of problems for our community of amateurs. The service they provide, I was 20 years a volunteer firefighter, EMT, and lieutenant with the fire department in Ohio, and we depended on VHF radio because even though they had the 800 megahertz system of the fire department and police have here, when we got far enough away and the towers were down or one of the towers was down, the only thing that worked was the amateur radio, and it got us out of a lot of problems. So this is something I think we should be grateful for. I don't think we need to create obstacles for. I don't think we need to 7.5-foot setback obviously is not going to work. It just isn't going to work because it essentially puts us out of business. Same with 20-foot. The towers, assumption that the towers are ugly is not really necessarily true. Most of the time, they're not even noticed. And you look at the questions that were brought up here, how many people, well, how many do we have? Well, we don't really know. The reason we don't know is they aren't that obvious. So I think we ought to bear this in mind and not make a mountain out of a molehill here. I also do not see the ordinance printed, so I don't really know. I assume it's the one that the Planning Commission said we don't really need, that we're talking about. And so I would encourage us not to go further, but perhaps to see what we could do to make something that is workable in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? EA 09-18. Second call. Anybody else? Please rise, make your way to the podium. We're going to have last call after this speaker. So if you want to speak, make your way behind this gentleman.
Good morning. My name is David Shaw, K4DES. I'm a resident of Burnt Store Isles. My comments are going to be a little different. They're couched as questions. If you've read the entire ZA 09-18, do you believe that it provides, quote, reasonable accommodation to amateur radio operators as required by FCC PRB 1 dated September 19th, 1985, and which is still valid today, and specifically states local regulations which involve the placement, screening, or height of antennas based on health, safety, or aesthetic considerations must be crafted to accommodate reasonably amateur communications and to relinquish the minimum practicable regulation to accomplish the local authority's legitimate purpose. Do you know that, unlike commercial radio stations that transmit all the time, amateur radio operation is typically 85% receiving or listening and only 15% transmitting? Do you know that not all antenna support structures or towers are retractable, and those that are retractable are lowered only for maintenance, severe weather conditions, or when the operator is away? Do you also know that trees and dock pilings are often used as support structures for amateur radio antennas? Since they are not addressed in this draft ordinance, how are they to be treated? Do you realize that requiring a, quote, Florida licensed surveyor imposes prohibitive costs to the amateur radio operator and is unnecessary when in fact a simple plot plan showing the proposed location of the antenna support structure would be adequate? Also, in the area of ridiculous requirements, what is an FCC recognized expert in the field of radio communications as required for support structure heights over 70 feet? Do you realize there is no such entity, which clearly illustrates the lack of understanding of amateur radio by staff and the city attorney? Why was the unanimous recommendation for denial of the proposed ordinance totally ignored by staff and the city attorney in their zeal to approve this onerous ordinance? Have you forgotten that amateur radio provided the only reliable communications after Hurricane Charlie as it does today with Hurricane Michael? Do you seriously want to harm that asset to the city? Are you aware that Charlotte County has a simple amateur radio antenna ordinance waiver process that applies to dwellings on canals similar to PGI and BSI, known as Chapter 3.9, Article 3, Special Regs, Section 3968, Communication Towers. Exempt telecommunications facilities. 1, the following telecommunications facilities are exempt from the provisions of this section, provided they do not exceed 50 feet in height or the maximum height allowed to the zoning district, whichever is greater. Amateur radio antennas and towers. Why would City Council approve this fatally flawed ordinance, which is full of onerous requirements, defies reasonable accommodation, ignores the denial recommendation of the Planning Commission, is in direct conflict with the federal objectives? Please vote no to the passing of this ordinance. Thank you.
Anybody else? Last call. Last call. Closing the public hearing after this speaker, unless somebody rises to move to the podium.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Excuse me, thank you very much. Good morning. The proposed Punta Gorda ordinance has...
Please.
My name is Steve Soley, S-O-L-E-Y. The proposed Punta Gorda ordinance is flawed. It discriminates against a minority. It singles out only one class of individuals who erect towers, amateur radio operators. It does not look at other erectors and users of towers. The other major flaw is incomplete and inadequate definition of an amateur radio tower. Similar towers can be used by different classes of individuals for different purposes. For example, TV reception, shortwave listening, FM radio reception, CB radio, citizens band, flagpoles, decorative and/or security lighting, etc. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to differentiate an amateur radio antenna from any other type of antenna which may be mounted on a tower. How does a government entity accurately define, identify, and regulate something like a tower that has a multiplicity of shapes, sizes, and uses? Amateur radio operators are required to complete many hours of study and testing to become a Federal Communications Commission's licensed operator. They are a benevolent national resource that performs emergency radio communications during and after hurricanes and other disasters when normal communication links are destroyed. Just like happened here this morning, electronics does have problems. It's good to have a backup system.
Duly noted.
Okay, again, back to amateur radio operators. They are a benevolent national resource that performs, they should never be confused with CB radio operators, citizens band radio operators, who are essentially untrained and unregulated. Shortly after hurricanes flattened Puerto Rico last year, the American Red Cross asked for 50 amateur radio volunteers to provide emergency communications. Within hours, the call was met, and many volunteers worked for months in Puerto Rico in very difficult circumstances. The Amateurs Code, Item 6, states, "The amateur is patriotic. His knowledge and his station are always ready for the service of his country and his community." We ask that the City Council approve and adopt the Planning Commission's recommendation to deny the ordinance request. Said ordinance would impair and penalize the amateur radio community that stands at the ready to serve the citizens of Punta Gorda. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call. Anybody?
Move to close public hearing.
Second.
We have a motion, a second, to close the public hearing. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Okay. So,
Wait, before you start, can you just address the comment that we're ignoring the planning commission? Can you just explain how the process works?
We are required, once we advertise an ordinance, it goes to the planning commission. After the planning commission makes a recommendation, it then goes to city council. We cannot stop an ordinance from coming in front of city council once the planning commission makes a recommendation. That is the process. The process is the planning commission hears it first, makes a recommendation, then it goes in front of this body, and you've already heard what this body is saying, and that is the process. So we are not ignoring it. Matter of fact, we are doing exactly the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you.
okay. So the expression that perception is reality has put into my focus the fact that there is a completely wrong perception of what this ordinance is intended to do and how it was, what its genesis was. This was not initially a complaint-driven effort. We received a request back in before 2009 by a amateur radio operator who wanted to exceed the limits that are in our ordinance that apply to not just amateur radio antenna, but TV antenna and CB antenna and cupolas and a whole bunch of other things. And it was our intent to be able to facilitate that amateur radio operator to put in the antenna that would serve its purposes. Unfortunately, our code, as it was written at that time and remains written, would not allow for you to automatically be able to build the antenna that you need to have to service your area. There was an unspecified waiver process, which I don't know how long that process has been on the books, but is one that does not meet current law in general with respect to discretionary actions by, in a quasi-judicial fashion, by the city council. In other words, you can't just ask the city council for a waiver of a provision of the ordinance based on whatever whim that they might have at that time. Variance processes are required to have all kinds of criteria that need to be satisfied before the city council can grant a variance from a provision in the code. Clearly, it was not our intention to equate the waiver that was suggested in the code as it existed and as it presently exists, to go through a whole list of criteria that would be necessary and onerous criteria before the city council can grant approval for an antenna. So we decided that it would be appropriate first to find out from the regulated community what would be necessary to address the provisions of the federal law that are intended to facilitate your operations. I profess right from the start that I'm not an expert on this stuff. What I reached out to was the community to provide me with education. I consulted with by way of addressing their website and learning from what they had to say, the national organization. We received input. And so our intention was to fix what is right now a broken process. This ordinance, the ordinance is, as it presently exists, is broken. If you want us to take the action that you are seeking, and the one apparently that the Planning Commission recommended, we would do nothing. You'd be left with an ordinance that has a provision that provides that the maximum height of your antenna, as well as all of the other antennas, would be 42 feet. That's what you want. The city council, I'm sure, would be very happy to grant that wish. But what we are trying to do is to provide a mechanism in the ordinance that gives you a height by right, that you won't need to come to the city council for any type of approval process. And that height was determined to be 70 feet based on a consideration of all of the information that was provided to us. If 70 feet is not appropriate for this area and you think 80 feet is, it's a simple matter to have the ordinance modified before it's finally adopted to have a maximum height of 80 feet. And hopefully that will solve anyone's concerns. As I heard, one of the speakers, their antenna is only 50 feet. Well, that would automatically qualify for approval without having to go through any type of waiver process, variance process, whatever, to exceed the ordinance as it exists currently. With respect to the attractable antenna, that is a provision in the code that would say if you cannot meet the height, the maximum height that's been provided by right, and as it's presently drafted, it's 70 feet, and you need to have a antenna higher than 70 feet, well, you can get that by having a retractable antenna. Hopefully, whatever height we establish in this ordinance would be sufficient to meet everyone's needs to be able to adequately serve our area. In my survey of ordinances around the country, I've found, depending upon, where they're located, a higher antenna might have been necessary. For example, there was one jurisdiction that had, I think, allowed up to 100 feet by right. And that was a function of where that antenna was located. If 80 feet or 70 feet is appropriate here, that's what we should adopt. The ordinance, and this ordinance is intended to meet what the federal requirements are. There was the county's ordinance was just cited. I assure you that if there was a challenge of the compliance of the county's ordinance with the federal law, the county's ordinance would be stricken as being inconsistent with the requirements of the federal law. This ordinance was drafted in mind not to penalize amateur radio operators, but to facilitate their operation and recognition of the service that they provide. Some of the, and let me say, the requirement for the structure to be certified by a FCC licensed engineer, I did not make that up. That was something that was either that came from another ordinance or came from the association. If that's inappropriate language, that's why we have a public hearing, to try to educate us as to where we've gone wrong. But bear in mind, the idea here is to allow for an antenna that serves your purpose. There are other considerations that you must recognize, and that is of safety. The ordinance provides that and requires, I don't know whether it's possible, I'm just following what the recommendations of the association and other jurisdictions were, that the antenna be designed that it collapse upon itself in a storm. I don't know, I can't tell you whether that's feasible or not. I'm hoping that you can tell me whether it's feasible or not feasible. But that's the idea, so that if there's going to be damage as a result of this very high structure, it will be contained upon the property where the structure is located and doesn't fall onto adjacent properties to cause damage to those adjacent properties. The setback is intended for that purpose as well. There's no way that if you set back a structure 7 feet or 10 feet or even 20 feet, that the additional footage from the side yard is going to be any less of an aesthetic issue for the neighbor. So it's not, the setback's not for aesthetics, the setback is for safety. I don't know how close to a side yard you can construct an antenna of 70 or 80 feet, whatever council decides, so that if it falls, even upon itself, whether it can fall within an area of 7 feet. I don't know. But that's why there's a setback provided for here. And so again, I'm sorry if the perception is that this onerous ordinance is trying to restrict amateur radio operators. It was the intention, frankly, is just the opposite, because we found when the question was first posed to us in 2009 that our ordinance wasn't adequate to meet your needs, and we needed to make sure that our ordinance was consistent with the FCC so that somebody wouldn't challenge us for giving you the opportunity to operate and be violative of federal law. So I appreciate the input, and if there's an opportunity for tweaking this ordinance, this is the time to do it. But the idea is to single you out. I shouldn't use this language, because somebody who's not having the benefit of this ordinance, like somebody with a TV antenna that wants to put up 80 feet, right now they can't do that. But we're trying to provide an opportunity for you to do that because of the service that you provide. That's all I have.
Thank you. Well, clearly, I mean, if we stick with what is written, we do not have a waiver process to go over 42 feet.
Correct.
There is no way to go over 42 feet.
It's in the language, but it's not an effective, it's not a legal.
There's no process, there's no criteria, there's no way to really even go forth with that. So clearly, we have an issue here. I think what I've heard with some of the language, the detailed language that you took your time to really detail in this ordinance, would be the survey, having to get a surveyor for the site plan. Is that something we could live without?
We could, but again, if there's a necessity for a setback, and if you decide that the setbacks is important for safety purposes, then we need to know where the property boundaries are, and we need to know where that, accurately where that is going to be located. A sketch will be fine as long as we have the opportunity to go out and do some measurements, but nevertheless, we don't have staff to do that. And that's why we require for everything, almost everything that requires zoning approval or building permit, a surveyor to go out and make the accurate measurements. And it's not onerous, it's not a whole lot of money. I know everything's relative, but we're not asking for a $2,000 survey.
Well, I've heard that and the setbacks, obviously, that we heard about here. And then just get into this a little bit more about the professional engineer. Wasn't that only if you wanted to go in excess of the height that we would agree on? D, 2D. If the applicant requires an antenna height in excess of the height specified, which is a number that we could negotiate, they would have to go into the building
Yeah,
for a special permit.
And I'm still looking for the FCC certified engineer. I mean, the language that I see is sworn testimony of an FCC recognized expert in the field of radio communications. Remember, there's got to be a little bit of a balancing here. We don't want someone to build the biggest antenna that they can afford to build just because they want to have the biggest antenna they can afford to build, because we do have to recognize today's residential neighborhoods are much more built out than they were back in the 60s and 70s, and a very large antenna does have impacts on the neighbors. So the question becomes, and as FCC requires, we need to be able to accommodate reasonable operation, effective operation of amateur radio communications. But if for example, an 80-foot antenna would work and serve the local needs, to put a 150-foot antenna in order to justify that much deviation from what would be locally acceptable, the ordinance provides, at the recommendation of the national agency association, that there be an expert to explain why that antenna needs to exceed the maximum height by right in that particular location. We're not, and that's the whole thing about this process, is if we're going to make a decision, it needs to be made based on facts, and it works both ways. You're entitled to have a decision that is based on credible, competent, substantial evidence, and the city council can't just simply arbitrarily deny you because they don't like the way it looks, feels, or sounds. So with the requirement for an expert to come in to justify it, it gives the city council adequate factual basis to make a decision, because clearly the neighbor is going to come in and complain about the height of the antenna. And we can't just say, well, you're right, we don't like the height of the antenna either, you're denied. Because, I mean, the applicant would be denied because that would run afoul of the FCC regulations. So we need to be advised, the city council needs to be advised when it goes beyond what you'd be entitled to have by right as to how to make that decision as to whether that request is consistent with the requirements of the FCC or not consistent with the requirements of the FCC. And I assure you, as best as I can assure you, that I have read all of the FCC guidance that's been cited in this ordinance to tell me what our responsibilities are in terms of being able to make sure that you have the opportunity to do the service that you're recognized as important to the United States.
Yes, Jaha?
I think probably if we're going to do anything at all, it would only be to look at the outer limit. Like, let's say what would be, let's say a height that would require and necessitate engineering. I see outside of that, these other things are onerous. I think like setbacks, for example. If a tower is 80 feet tall and even a 20-foot setback is still going to hit something next to it. So, I mean, these are things that only would obstruct people operating. I personally still maintain my certification to provide radio telephone license testing. And so I personally feel this is essential for our public safety infrastructure. And I think anything that's going to obstruct this is problematic. I would see that, let's say if we said 80 or 100 feet, after that, then maybe we'll require all these other things. But I think outside of our current operations, I don't really see an issue. I think if we just simply raise the height to allow people to legally operate their current towers, that I say that really kind of is all we need to do.
So if we did that, if we raised the height and we struck the language about the waiver process, then nothing else would be allowed, correct? We just said maximum height of 80 feet and got rid of the city council may grant a waiver to these limitations. If we got rid of that and we just increased the height, then anything over that would not be allowed and there would be no process to come and apply for anything higher than whatever the number is that we would decide on.
Certainly, you can amend the existing ordinance that changes the restriction as it applies to amateur radio antenna from what would be effectively the 42 feet to 70, 80, 100, whatever you want to do. And that's the only amendment. We'll strike the language about the waiver.
The waiver.
And so all the other activities that are currently in that ordinance would remain prohibited without any waiver. And the only way they could get above that would be go through the variance process. That's fine, you could do that. When you strike all the other stuff out of this ordinance, which is certainly your prerogative, you're taking out all those things that are intended to protect the neighboring properties from what could happen when you've got this big structure that falls down upon the neighbor's property. And you can do that too. You know, this is considered to be a police regulation. Police not in the blue line way, but our regulations to protect health, safety, and welfare. You can take all that stuff out there, so you're not providing any additional protection for health, safety, and welfare, and that's your prerogative.
Lynn?
I think that's the direction we need to go. I think we need to make this the least offensive that we can possibly make it. This service is invaluable to everyone in the community. And certainly, after Hurricane Charlie, I personally have a personal experience with a good friend